Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In today's class, we are going to discuss about regulation of the Islamic banking system. The objective of this lecture is basically to highlight the rationales of having specific regulatory framework for Islamic finance. Number two, we will discuss the overview of the regulatory framework applicable to Islamic financial system. Last but not least, to elaborate various regulatory issues and challenges facing the regulatory authorities, especially in the case of Malaysia. So, among the features that distinguish the Islamic financial system from the conventional system are the regulations that govern each institutions. While the conventional financial institutions have been established and governed by man-made laws and regulations and a secular system, the IFI is governed by the man-made laws and regulations, but in addition to that, they are required to adhere to the Sharia laws and principles. So the Islamic financial institutions in its modern form is indeed a recent phenomenon that started more than 60 years ago, and it is understandable that the legal and regulatory practices governing the Islamic financial institutions remain very different across countries. Yeah? Since the early 1970s, the growth of Islamic financial services um, has been quite robust. Yeah. So this is in relation to the rapid political, social, and economic development of many countries as the countries gain independence from their colonial masters. While most countries that operate Islamic financial institution has adopted a dual financial system, yeah, most of these institutions are actually influenced by the socio-political background, yeah? Except in the case of Iran and also Sudan. So both of these countries had adopted a single full-fledged Islamic financial system. Yeah? The majority of the countries which offer Islamic financial services are actually adopted the dual financial system, where the conventional financial system is practiced side by side with the Islamic financial system. So, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, yeah. So for Saudi Arabia and Egypt, there are no specific Islamic banking laws are enacted to govern the specificities of the Islamic financial institutions. Yeah? Therefore, they operate under the same laws governing the conventional banks. Yeah? Whereas in the countries that adopted the single full-fledged Islamic banking system, such as Sudan and Iran, so both of these countries have adopted Islamic accounting standards, established requirements for Sharia supervisory boards, as well as putting place of supervisory framework which are specific for the Islamic financial institutions. So according to a survey carried out by Nick Sani and Osman in 2008, At least there are 30 countries which have enacted specific Islamic banking laws. Yeah? And these Islamic banking laws are actually um, express provisions for Islamic banking activities in their existing banking laws. However, these laws vary in terms of their scope, and some appears to replicate the regulatory and supervisory framework applied for the conventional banks into the Islamic financial institutions. This is done without considering the unique characteristics of Islamic banking system. Yeah, for example, in the case of Islamic financial institutions, they are exposed to a very specific kind of risk. So in this case, it is important for the regulatory regulation to cater such unique characteristics of Islamic banking. So in a summary, we can say that there are at least three approaches which have been adopted by countries that to regulate the Islamic financial institutions in their countries. Yeah? On the on the first hand, so the IFIs are governed by law that regulates all banks, meaning that the Islamic financial institutions are using the same laws which regulates the conventional financial institutions. Second approach is whereby the Islamic financial institutions are regulated by the Islamic Acts. They have very specific acts to govern the or to regulate the Islamic financial institutions. And the third approach is basically the Islamic financial institutions are regulated by the fiduciary laws, such as practice in Lebanon. So what is actually the meaning of legal framework? Yeah. So legal framework is basically a broad system of rules that governs and regulates decision making, agreements, laws, and etc. So basically a legal doctrine, a legal framework is actually a doctrine, a set of rules, procedural steps, and it is often established through precedent in the common law, through which judgments can be determined in a given legal case. Yeah? So based on this framework, based on this legal framework, um, judgment can be taken or can be decided in any uh, legal case appeared in the financial system, for example. So the legal framework is a system that is used by um, each system to interpret and enforce law upon uh, those players in the system. And it is adopted by a jurisdiction, whether based on common law or civil law. And in some countries or in some legal framework operates in a very specific area, such as in the land. For in the case of Malaysia, we have Land Code Act, Land Code Act, and then on real property, on commerce and trade, regulation and supervision of banking and finance, and etc. So currently, we have at least three main legal systems which are available in the world. So the first legal systems is basically the civil law, and the second one is the common law, and the last but not least is the Sharia law. Yeah. So the first two, civil law and common law, is basically practiced throughout the world. whereby the Sharia law is practiced in mostly the Muslim majority country, if it is not all, but some in some countries, yeah, in some Muslim majority countries. In these slides, we show to you the approaches to regulation of Islamic financial institutions. Yeah, so it can be based on the civil law. If you can see here, it can be based on the civil law or on the common law or on the Sharia law. So these are the three main legal systems which are available in providing the legal and regulatory regulation for the Islamic financial institutions. Yeah. In the case of civil law, we can see that some Muslim majority countries such as Algeria, Indonesia, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Turkey is actually being practiced by these Muslim majority countries. Yeah, and in these countries, they practice a dual banking system whereby the Islamic and conventional financial institutions are actually operating hand to hand or side by side between both of these institutions. And in terms of the legislative framework, so Indonesia, Lebanon, Turkey have enacted specific legislation for IFIs, meaning that although they are using the civil law, they are actually have enacted a specific legislation for the Islamic financial institutions, whereby other than these countries, so they have incorporated sections for Islamic activities under the existing banking law. Yeah, and interestingly, in the case of Indonesia, they has a central Sharia body, meaning that the Sharia body is actually or the Sharia matters pertaining to Sharia. Um, in the case of central banks, so they have the central Sharia body in Indonesia. And for minority Muslim population countries such as Philippines, Thailand, Switzerland, yeah. So the banking system practiced in these countries are actually the conventional banking system, and the Islamic financial institution have a very small presence in these countries. In the case of Philippines and Thailand, so they have enacted a specific legislation for Islamic financial institutions. And for Switzerland, say, it is mentioned that they have regulated the Islamic financial institution is actually regulated under the existing banking law. And there are no the Sharia body or Sharia board is not present or not regulated in the case of these countries. And in the case of common law legal system, we can see Bangladesh, Brunei, and Malaysia can be considered as using the common law, and they are practicing the dual banking system. And in the case of Malaysia, we have enacted specific legislation for Islamic financial institutions. Yeah, and for Bangladesh, Brunei, so they have incorporated sections for Islamic banking activities under the existing banking law. So they do not have a very specific legislation or act for to cater for the Islamic financial institution. In the case of Malaysia, we currently have the Islamic Financial Services Act, Islamic Financial Services Act, in order to which is a specific act, in order to govern to regulate the Malaysian Islamic financial institutions. And in the case of Malaysia and Brunei, so it is a common regulatory requirement that at the Islamic financial institutions level, so they have to appoint a Sharia board, and similarly in the case of having a regulatory requirement to have a central Sharia body. For in the case of Malaysia, so we have a central Sharia board at the central bank level. Or in the case of common law for Muslim majority countries such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Sri Lanka, and UK. So we have they practice the conventional banking system, and Islamic financial institution also having a very small presence in these countries. So what they did for the legislative framework, so basically is incorporating sections for Islamic activities or issued specific guidelines under the existing banking law. So in the case of Sharia body, so these countries do not regulate uh, having a Sharia board, but a common presence. So for example, in the case of UK, in the case of Sri Lanka, so they have the Sharia board, but it is not regulated. It's not regulated. And in the case of legal system which practice Sharia legal system, so the countries that we can, most of these countries are I think all are the Muslim majority countries, yeah, such as the GCC, Gulf Cooperation countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi, UAE, Iran, Sudan, and Pakistan and Yemen. So, for example, in the case of Middle East countries, yeah, the GCC and all the list here, so they practice the dual system except for Oman, which has no Islamic financial institutions. Yeah, and in the case of Kuwait and UAE, so they have enacted a specific legislation for Islamic financial institutions. And interestingly, in the case of Bahrain, so they have a very specific rule book, such as the Sharia standards issued by the IOP. And in the case of Qatar and Saudi, so they have regulated Islamic activities under the existing banking law. In the case of Iran and Sudan, so their banking system is actually a single full-fledged Islamic banking system, and the legislative framework is very specific for Islamic financial institutions. Yeah, so because they do not have any conventional financial institutions, so that's why they have a very specific legislative framework for the Islamic financial institutions. In the case of Pakistan and Yemen, so they practice a dual banking system. Yemen have enacted a specific legislation for Islamic financial institutions, while Pakistan they have a list of Islamic activities under the existing banking law. So it is not a common regulatory requirement at the Islamic financial institutions level to have a Sharia board. Sorry, at the Islamic financial institutions level, so it is a common regulatory requirement to have a Sharia board, but they do not have any central Sharia board in their case. And in contrast, Sudan and Pakistan, so they have a central Sharia board, regulated central Sharia board in their case. So that's all for some introduction overview on the regulation of Islamic financial institutions. So in the next video, we are going to discuss about the rationale for regulations of Islamic finance. Thank you very much.